So hi and welcome everybody to my second talk of this series. Now we will switch topics a little bit and we will make a change towards another field of cognitive psychology that I'm doing mainly my research in, and that is human wayfinding. And since I do not know what the audience of today's talk would be like, I decided for a more general overview because I didn't know who is familiar with so-called landmark-based wayfinding and how much do you know, what are you interested in. So I'm trying to talk a little bit about our research from our own lab mainly, and then in the end about some perspectives for the future. And maybe some of you feel encouraged to say this is a research field worth pursuing or not. And maybe we can get at the end also into discussion. Since this is more or less a research talk and not so much a more theoretical like the ones before, I would ask you, whenever there's something that is unclear, you have a question or you have an idea, please feel free to raise your hand to show up and say, okay, here's something that we should discuss. So I would like to keep it a little bit more informal than before. Okay, so let's start. For the agenda of this talk, I chose, first of all, I would like to introduce you a little bit to so-called landmark-based wayfinding. Then I will speak a little bit about multisensory processing and integration, because one of the major problems that we are faced with, and that's not only true for my university, but for others as well, is that there is, especially in psychological research, a tremendous bias towards vision. But we all know humans possess different senses, so we also need to take the question into account, why is that? It's pretty much the same as with consciousness about functions. So we will address the question of functions in our senses. And there we will also see that some of our senses have been neglected for a long time, which is, from my point of view, from my perspective, absolutely not acceptable. Then I will dive into our own research on landmark-based wayfinding. There I will just present some overviews of our own research. As I said, I just want to familiarize you a little bit with the general paradigms of our research, but I don't want to go into much detail of each and every experiment, because that could be quite boring. If you are not into that topic, then a research talk on one or two experiments would not be really helpful. That's why I decided to give a more general overview. And then towards the perspectives, I will talk about landmark-based wayfinding and AI. And in this context, we will finally or probably return to the topic of consciousness, as I already introduced before, that this is also strongly related to how humans act, how we interact with AI, and that also deals a little bit with the question, what is AI mainly made for, and what are humans making from it? And finally, I will talk a little bit about the future of wayfinding experiments and wayfinding research, because as I already said, from my perspective, there's quite some biases that we at least need to reduce. I don't want to make the claim that we should replace vision with our sense of hearing or sense of smell. That's not the point. I just want to point out that it is important to take the other senses into account as well. Okay, so let's start with current research perspectives or current research on landmark-based wayfinding. So first of all, we need to clarify what is a landmark. This is also a word that we use quite often in everyday life. And a landmark could actually be almost anything that we are capable of connecting or associating with a type of spatial information. In this research field, there's the differentiation, for example, also between global and local landmarks. So, for example, if you go outside and you look upwards, then the Cathedral of Oviedo would be some kind of global landmark because you can see it from different points, from different positions in the surroundings. It depends. Sometimes in the inner city, the buildings are too high so that it is occluded and you cannot see it anymore. But still, due to its size, and when you are standing on the plaza before it, then it is definitely a global landmark that helps you to orient yourself in the environment. Other forms of global landmarks could be the mountain next to Oviedo, because that's also something that you can see from far away and from different locations. And in comparison to that, we talk also about so-called local landmarks. These are points of interest or some signs or objects, whatever, I will talk about that a little bit later, that help to locate you at a certain position. So that means if you walk through the city here of Oviedo and somebody tells you you have to reach at Gascona, you have to reach that wooden barrel. That wooden barrel is then becoming for you a landmark. So there is not that we can say this is a landmark and this is not a landmark, but the thing has to be visible, or at least has to be perceivable. You have to perceive the thing and you have to make connections with spatial orientation or with spatial directions, which means that for people, different things become landmarks or maybe not. So it's also about idiosyncrasy, whether it plays a role for yourself, whether something is of interest, like when you are hungry, then a restaurant would be a very good landmark for you to orient, because your attention would be drawn right away to a restaurant. Whereas if you are just coming from a restaurant, or there's many restaurants at the same place, then one single restaurant would not be really helpful. So a landmark also needs to be differentiable from the rest of the environment, which means a red house could be a very good landmark, but if it's located among, let's say, 20 other red houses in that area, it would basically be useless. So you cannot just say it has to be present due to color or its shape, but it has to be different from its environment. And the American geographer Dan Montello said that any of them, so he's talking about landmarks, can be sensorially, typically visually distinctive, recalled or recognized, used to guide wayfinding. So whenever these objects are connected to or associated with spatial directions, they can be of help in order to help us with navigation. There's, of course, other forms of navigation that I don't want to address. Like, for example, we know in ants, for instance, that they perform very well path integration. And there's other strategies also, like sequential learning. So when somebody provides you with a description where to go, that's what navigation systems often do, is they say something like, in the next intersection you make a right turn, then you go straight on for about 1 kilometer, and then you make a left turn. And that would be simple learning of sequences without landmarks. But here we are mainly focused on landmarks. Okay, so Montello said that everything, or most things, can be landmarks, and in brackets it said typically visually. And there we already see a little bit this bias. in landmark-based wayfinding, one of the famous books was published in 1960 by the architect Kevin Lynch. And for him, he was quite clear, almost everything that is visually perceivable, distinct from the environment or from the rest of the environment, can serve as a landmark. And this can be railway stations, even certain districts with different architecture and so on could resemble landmarks. However, since he was an architect, there was nothing said about the other senses. And this has proceeded throughout navigation research. And the other fact is that in psychology, we already also have this bias towards vision, that it is a sense that is well investigated. We know a lot about it. The visual cortex is rather easy to investigate in comparison to other parts of the brain. So probably it was quite normal or logical that such a bias has occurred during the times. So what I came up then about 8 to 10 years ago, I had the idea, okay, this is probably not the whole story. And what I came up with was in 2020 with a theoretical work on the case that I claimed that visual landmarks are exaggerated. Saying, okay, there's more to landmark-based wayfinding than just vision. And I said in my work, for my psychological purpose, a landmark can be any type of information. May it be an object, a verbal piece of information, a sound, a smell, and the like, that can be linked to spatial information in order to aid wayfinding. Why is that? Because some researchers have claimed that landmarks have to be permanent. Of course, that makes sense. You could not very well use a car as a landmark, only if it were moving and you tell somebody, draw his or her attention towards saying, there where the red car is making a right turn, there you have to go. Then it would be okay. But you could not remember in the future, oh, what was the intersection where the red car made the right turn, because it's not present anymore. So being constantly there was an argument for a good landmark. And we know, for instance, auditory signals, smells, they come and they disappear. They are not permanent. So I tried to put more to that definition of what could be a landmark. There's even the debate when you take visual landmarks, whether it has to be discrete objects or whether just a word or a street sign is a landmark or not. There's even researchers claiming that a street sign cannot be a landmark, or that some verbal information are no landmarks, and so on. So I was pretty unsatisfied with this situation, and so I claimed, okay, maybe visual landmarks are a little bit too prominent in our research field, and we have to focus on other senses as well. So to give that impression and my assumptions a little bit more strength, I did analyze the latest review on landmarks in wayfinding, and that was published in 2021. And I simply looked up for keywords. And the first that I looked up, so it's a classic review paper with way more than 100 references and many experiments that are presented. And if you simply count and look for the word visual, you find this in this review paper on landmarks exactly 100 times. It's a paper of about, I don't know exactly, 12 to 15 pages in total, but you find the word visual 100 times. If you look for the word acoustic stimulation, then you find 3 works being cited in this review. And if you go one step further and use the word olfaction or olfactory, you will get only a single hit. And this single hit is a work of mine that I'm going to present a little bit later. So it's from our research group. So back then, when this review was published, nobody in my research field was really interested in smell, and only few in the processing of auditory signals. So that's the reason why even earlier, oh, there's my reference with 2023 is not correct down there. It has to be 2021. Sorry for that. But already before, I turned more towards acoustic stimulation and then smell, even though my supervisor said, why are you not just investigating something that you can very well, where you are familiar with? Why do you want to go in such a difficult and not very useful topic? And I said, well, that's your point of view, but not mine. So I think that especially the sense of smell is not only underrepresented in the literature, but also underestimated. And so we have to look a little bit, why is this the case? So unfortunately, I did some work on auditory stimulation, but this talk today is more on smell, because that's where I also wanted to engage the audience a little bit more with, and to show you how valuable it can be to think about smell a little bit more. So the fact that humans do possess a poor sense of smell is, according to McGann, a 19th century myth that can be traced back to the famous Paul Broca. You all know him, about Broca's area in motor cortex, in the frontal lobe, and so on. The reason is that back then it was claimed, okay, the olfactory cortex is way smaller than, for instance, the visual cortex. And due to the fact that there's animals like dogs that can smell much better than we can, it's useless to think about smell, because humans have a deteriorated sense of smell. However, physiological studies nowadays show that humans are having a much better sense of smell than has been assumed. So why is that? For instance, the density of neurons in the olfactory bulb is way higher than in the visual cortex. Of course, that makes it more difficult to investigate, but that's not a reason for staying away from it. So, of course, we do have less genes that are responsible for smelling in comparison to rats and dogs. No question. But still, if it were useless, why would evolution have still provided us with something like a sense of smell if it were as bad as many people claimed? So I once had the experience myself that I was submitting my very first paper on olfaction and wayfinding, and the action editor just made a personal comment by saying, okay, if I commute every day, or if I am in a new surrounding, I do not become aware of the smells around, and so it's useless. I'm normally focusing on my visual sense. And the result was that my manuscript was not even sent out to any reviewer. It was not evaluated. It was just a personal comment by the action editor saying, basically, smell is useless and doesn't make much sense for landmark-based wayfinding, so I'm not going to send it. And he rejected it outright. And that motivated me to say, okay, that's not really acceptable. That's not a really good point, because we know from our everyday life and also from our education that there is some value to smell, even if we become not aware of them. There we are touching again the topic of consciousness. We all know about pheromones, for instance. Mating behavior. People seem to smell which kind of immune system the possible partner has. We do not become aware of that. But it has been shown that normally people mate with each other who have way different immune systems, because that will produce healthier offspring. And it has also been shown that those people who engage with each other, that the relationships are normally stronger than for those people with similar or rather identical immune systems. There we can fully accept that smell plays a role, even though we do not become aware of them. So why should it be that humans are so poor at smelling and this is not valuable for spatial orientation? And in a clever study at Berkeley University, Porter and colleagues showed that when you produce the right experiment, which is okay for a human being, then you will see that the traces they are taking for following a scent path is pretty much the same as for dogs. So on the left-hand side, you cannot really see it very good, but down here with the yellow line, there's the burn, and the dog is the red line walking around and always deviating from the strongest smell of this trail, deviating but coming back all the time. And on the right-hand side, you can see a person with blindfolded eyes crawling around, and that's why I said beforehand we will have some kind of ridiculous example, but from my point of view it is a very clever and smart experiment. It is shown that humans do the same. Of course, we are very, very slow. Of course, we are not as precise as the dog is. But the point here is we can do it. The thing is here, what they did, you have to do it with scents that we are familiar with, that we know, something that gives us meaning. So this experiment was done with wolf thread that was put into chocolate beforehand, so that the participants could smell the chocolate. So you have to take smells for something like that that are appropriate for us. You could also use something like red wine. Whereas if you take the smell of, I don't know, something that is valuable for a dog, for instance, smelling other dogs where they went by, that's not really of interest for us. For us, we would just say that stinks and that's it, and then we would leave. So you have to take something that is of meaning for us, and then we can show pretty much the same behavior. To give you a rough idea of how our experiments look like, and this is something I started with more than 15 years ago, and I started basically with visual stimulation as well. So I also contributed in my career to that, towards that bias. So what we had is several virtual environments. Here I have a screenshot of a virtual environment, an indoor environment, that looked the same throughout the maze. It was a 10 by 10 maze. There was no special lighting conditions, so everything was constant, so that we had no shades, nothing that you normally have when you are simulating a real environment, because also the light source gives us implicit information about directions. And this is something that we had to control for. So in these older experiments that we also used until a couple of years ago, so this was our first surrounding that we programmed, we wanted to have the largest amount of experimental control possible. So we also did that with outdoor experiments where we had a green used for being like a park scene or whatever. But the most important thing in our virtual environment is that the visual stimulation throughout the maze was identical at each and every intersection. And we started then to do a learning phase and a so-called wayfinding phase, which might seem logical or necessary, which means we put the participants into the maze, we let them passively through the maze with the instruction to learn the path given the pictures that we presented at the intersections, and together we gave spatial information about how to proceed. And then the movie went on, so we not just gave the visual information, but the movie went on. So they could make up associations between the landmark information, and I call the pictures as well landmarks, and the directions. Here we used different things. We used toy images, we used images of animals, we used words of different things. No matter whether it's what it is in the visual sense, it works perfectly well. So the question is, why does he present something like that? This is trivial, the procedure. But I would like to remind you of the following. Until I started to publish the first experiments on this paradigm, spatial cognition research, and especially wayfinding research, was mainly based on recognition experiments, which means the participants had to learn a certain path through an environment, and afterwards they were just asked whether a landmark was present in the experiment or not. And from the yes and no answers, the scientists inferred the capability of the participants to orient themselves in a surrounding. And for me, that was quite shocking, saying, I cannot do navigation research by just asking yes and no questions. And so back then we started in the, it was about around 2010, then we invented this paradigm and started to say, no, a recognition phase is okay, we do that further, but we want to investigate real wayfinding in that people learn a path and then they have to retrace the path, or they have to, I don't know, to draw the path, whatever. But they have to do something that is related to real wayfinding, to spatial orientation, and not just saying, yes, this image has been in the experimental phase, and no, this one is a distractor that has not been there. As I said, we did these kind of recognition experiments because in the beginning we had some trouble convincing reviewers of this new paradigm. Of course, there have been some kind of wayfinding experiment in this sense before, but not especially or not widespread in our field. So it was mainly based on recognition. And so that's why I have back there something like a control phase. So first of all, they learned the sequence or the path. Then we asked them to give the appropriate answers during the video sequence to show where they have to go. And finally, we had a control phase. This was normally our recognition phase. Later, we changed that. And so right now, I'm not doing recognition experiments anymore, but I'm doing a so-called teleportation phase. Because many reviewers claimed back then, in the 2010s, that it could be that our participants are just learning the sequences. And from a working memory point of view, that would make sense. That you ignore all the material and just remember first intersection to the right, second intersection straight ahead, third intersection to the left. That's a much simpler way of learning. So you don't have to make these associations between images and the direction. And after we had quite some reviewer comments on this, we said, okay, we need to control for that. And that's why we invented a so-called teleportation phase, which means since our maze looks the same everywhere, we can just use a screenshot and put the needed stimulation at the intersection and just ask them, where do you have to go from here? So we could use intersection number 10, intersection number 18, number 3, and we randomized them. At the beginning, we just took a couple of these intersections. Nowadays, we also have a control phase where we use all the intersections in a random fashion and ask the people, where do you have to go from here? In order to really know about the landmarks and to know almost about everything that we could take from that. And this really shows that, of course, performance is a little bit lower than in the classical wayfinding condition because it's not the same path, but in everyday life, the path doesn't change. So the landmarks do not change their positions. So it is kind of artificial, but it comes very close to what we really want to investigate. Because some other reviewers said, okay, it's just one trial learning and then you have to retrace the route. This is something like just memory, working memory. But I think it's not, because we started with 8 intersections, went to 12 intersections, and our participants throughout produced ceiling effects. So we increased the number, and now our experiments normally run between 15 and 24 intersections. But with emotional stimuli from the so-called IAPS inventory, we were able to have participants learning a 36 intersection path and retracing it without any mistake. And this is something that you cannot explain just by sequential learning. And so if the landmarks have some value for the participants, then it's easier to do that. Okay, so this is the general idea. And here's some other ideas how we do it now. On top, you have screenshots of our current environment. So right now, since we are also trying to develop our things further, we moved from Google SketchUp to Minecraft. This is something where most students are really interested in, saying, yeah, I know Minecraft, this is a game I play myself. Unfortunately, we don't play anything there. We just have a very simplistic environment where we navigate them through, which means there are no enemies, no animals, there's no use of eating or whatever. There's hardly anything in it. But still, participants are quite excited because now we offer also stimulation on the auditory channel and also, as I introduced before, on the olfactory channel. At the beginning, in my first experiment that I published, we just had small brown glass vials with all the different smells in them so that the participants could not see what is in there, and we really held it under their noses and asked them to tell us where to go, or at first to learn the directions. Later on, we became a little bit more sophisticated when we found out, okay, this really works. People are capable of dealing with olfactory landmark information. Then we started to use VR goggles, head-mounted displays. We have right now, how many systems do we have? I think we have 3 systems of an HTC Vive in our lab that we are using, because this gives us the possibility of an even more immersive effect in order to control for stimulus presentation. Because some reviewers absolutely correctly argued, okay, it's kind of an artificial situation if the participant is looking on the screen and you hold something under their nose. And then we started saying, okay, let's go to the virtual environment with head-mounted displays. It's the same simulation, and they are not free to look anywhere in that part, because then we could not control for the stimulation, which means they are just looking at a simple video. But then we had the possibility to present different scents under their noses that don't have to be in brown glass vials. So we could use smelling sticks or the real product itself without people realizing, okay, somebody is holding something under my nose right now. The argument would be, okay, wouldn't it be easier to do something like controlled presentation with a so-called olfactometer? This is a device that can present you with smells directly into the nose, but the problem is the classic versions of them contain 8 channels. If you want to have more than 8 channels, then the device becomes really, really expensive, and we would need a device with at least 12 to 24 different channels. And this is something that we unfortunately cannot afford. And the amount of work that you have to put into these experiments would be extraordinarily high. So we tried to say, okay, this must work without any sophisticated device. We can do that in a very simple fashion, and so we did. So nowadays our participants are having the head-mounted display, so they can see the surrounding, and that's about it, and they do not really get to know where other signals like smell or auditory signals really come from. So for auditory signals we use headphones, of course, but this is something where we also have a pretty high level of experimental control. And on the left you see an overview of a map that we use for demonstration. This is one of the paths of the experiments, and here we had smells like at the first intersection it was fish, nail polish, pineapple, salami pizza, aftershave, alcohol, anise, cinnamon, curry, and so on. So we are using lots of different smells. In the meantime, we also did an experiment on the gustatory sense, where we used tea for the participants, but so far we didn't succeed. So this is something that doesn't work quite well. So we got back to the smell so far. Okay, so this is what they are learning, and this is what they have to retrieve. And so this is the general idea of our experiments. So now I would like to present a little bit of our research. And as I said, I'm not going to go too much into the details, rather to give you an overview. So this is just a screenshot of my first publication in this field, showing that odors can serve as landmarks in human wayfinding. Until then, there was no work available showing that smell could serve as a landmark. We did the experiments in the fashion that I just presented, so you are familiar with it, meaning in these kinds of experiments, when we compare them to vision or auditory signals, they are basically the same. So the percentage might be a couple of % lower than in vision, but when you in this experiment, when we compared that on a statistical level, there was no significant difference. So due to variation among between the participants, there was no significant difference between visual, acoustic, or olfactory landmarks. What we then also did, and we did that before already for visual stimuli and also for acoustic stimuli, is what about when we have to switch between signals? So my first example of a landmark here in Oviedo was the cathedral. But I do not need to see it. If I hear the bells, for example, ring, or I hear the clock on the tower, then I can also start to remember, oh, this is the cathedral bell, so I can locate myself and maybe know where to go. So we are capable of switching between modalities. Normally what we know from perception and cognition is that we know much about task switching, when people have to switch between tasks. But here, the task remains fully the same. The stimulus or the landmark remains the same. Only the modality in which it is processed differs. And here we could also show that humans are pretty much capable of doing that. Sometimes they become a little bit slower when they have to process olfactory signals, but this is mainly due to the fact that olfactory processing and also auditory processing take a little bit longer than visual processing. So this is in our nature, and this is not really an experimental effect. But what we could show is that people learn, for example, visual landmarks, and when you present them later on with the right smell, they could deal with it. So for example, you show them an image of a fish when they learn the path, and during retrieval, you just present them with the smell of the fish. They still can remember where they have to go, which means they make additional associations across the modalities. And this is also something that has not been demonstrated before. This is not the first paper. This is the one where we did on smell. We did that, as I said before, also on auditory signals. What else do we have? I already said at the beginning that landmarks also need sometimes to have an idiosyncratic relevance. And I talked about the 36 intersections when we present participants with emotional stimuli. This also makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, that we differentiate between good and bad, that we associate or that we have emotions. And so we also showed that with emotional material, here it was visual, in the meantime we are also working with acoustic and olfactory material in this way, that stimuli or landmarks that evoke emotions are really helpful for spatial orientation. And this is especially true for smells, because smell is differently processed in the brain than all the other senses, since it does not run through the thalamus at first, and it has direct connections to the amygdala and then to the hippocampus. And that's one of the reasons why many humans are capable of retrieving an experience like, oh, I had a smell in my nose and all of a sudden I have had a memory from my childhood. Something like, oh, I can remember 20 years ago I have been on vacation with my parents and it smelled exactly the same. So smell is directly linked to episodic and autobiographic memory. And this is something that we normally don't have with vision. Vision is more neutral. People say, okay, this is the image of a lemon. This is the image of an apple. But whenever I go home, and this is for sure going to happen, and will have at home my next glass of apple wine, I will definitely have the memory of last night here in Oviedo when we had cider, because it's pretty much the same, and it will definitely remind me, because it's such an emotional stimulus for me then, or emotional memory, that I will immediately be reminded of it. And as I said, it's a little bit less with auditory signals, and it's almost neutral and not present for vision. So here it's also worth looking at smell from that perspective, saying emotions play a role. Episodic memory plays a huge role. So why should we not investigate that? Why do we always push it aside, saying humans cannot smell well, that's too complicated, or that's not of interest? From my perspective, that's definitely not true. It's really worth pursuing it. And so emotions do play a huge role. Then we did some evaluations of different smells in order to find out what is positive smells, negative smells. We know from other research with the pictures, for example, that negative images or negatively connoted images work better for participants than neutral ones, but also better than positive ones. Even though the positive ones are still better than the neutral ones, the best effects we have are with negative ones. And that's something that you can find throughout cognitive research, that people are really good with negative material and not so good with positive material. There's one idea, one hypothesis that states that when people are, for example, in a good mood, they have a more or less holistic way of thinking and judging and deciding, whereas if they are themselves in a bad mood, they are more reasoning in an analytical fashion, and they are taking care of the details. That's one of the problems that we are faced with in depressive patients. So I also had a master's student. She later pursued a PhD at another university. She was applying these experiments to depressive patients with tremendous results, that they were indeed much worse than regular participants because of the fact they could not really concentrate. But whenever she then had material which was in accordance with the depression, which means negative material, all of a sudden they showed a quite normal level of performance in comparison to control participants. So here also emotions play a role, and that's why we also did an evaluation study on smells in order to say in the future, and maybe to also develop some kind of interventions, saying, okay, for which person, which strategy, which kind of material would be best. And that leads us to elder people that should stay in their own homes instead of nursery homes, and how to design nursery homes in the future. There, acoustic signals and smell will definitely play a huge role, even though here we are just doing some basic research in order to find out whether humans can do something or not. So what else? A couple of years ago, I started in this project also to work together with people from geoinformatics, because they are really interested in mapping these things. We know, we are all familiar with things like Google Maps. This is a visual. Of course, Google Maps can give us verbal advice where to go, but it does not present us with the surrounding sounds. Even though during the last days in the evening hours, it was sometimes quite annoying to have the sound checks from outside. But you could use this kind of information to really locate yourself, knowing, oh, there's the entrance of the building, and this is where the cathedral is located, the direction. So also these signals help for orientation. And so a colleague of mine from Augsburg University, Eva Nun, she's interested in mapping also auditory signals as well as olfactory signals. So we had students going out and really mapping. What can I smell where in order to make something like olfactory maps? The concept is not new. That has been proposed much earlier, but it has never been really followed in scientific research. So this is something that I'm really keen in about saying, okay, it's not just visual maps. We want to have multi-sensory integration, because that's what our system normally does. It takes information from all the senses. But in psychological research, due to controllability, due to the simplicity of experiments, due to the sake of interpretation of the results, we normally isolate the modalities from each other. But here we try to get as close to everyday life navigation, and that's why we are trying to integrate these things and want to make them available to the public later on. And this ended finally last year, that we also came up with a review on the meaning of smell in spatial orientation, that we wrote a state-of-the-art review based on this classical landmark review that I showed at the beginning, where there was this bias. And here we also tried to evaluate all the literature that is available right now, and to make the point, or to focus on the fact that human sense of smell should be considered more in future research. Let's go to some perspectives, some outlook for the future. As I said, smell and also auditory signals should be represented more in our research. And what else can we do? And here I several times talked about that I want to talk a little bit about AI. So one of the questions, and that also has to do with the mapping of olfactory and auditory signals, is how do humans really use AI systems? And 5 years ago, I was in a larger project involved where sociologists were interested in how humans navigate complex cultural and societal surroundings. So it was a more sociological aspect. But the question was to figure out, how do humans use AI systems? And for me, it was absolutely clear to say, okay, let's move down as far as possible. So nothing like ChatGPT or anything like that, but just saying, let's take a very simple AI system, namely navigation aids. And how do we interact with them? You are all familiar with the fact that when we do not know in an unfamiliar surrounding, it's very easy to pull out your phone, use something like Google Maps or whatever you have available, and then say, okay, where am I? Where do I want to go? Please show me the path. And even further, if you are sitting, for example, in your car and the navigation device tells you in 100 meters, make a right turn, or take the third exit in the roundabout, things like that. We are all familiar with that. But what does that mean? The problem here is that most people do not really engage anymore with spatial cognition. They are just following what the navigation aid tells them. And you all know these funny pictures on the internet where somebody dumped his car into a harbor, or where people are standing on a sandy beach, or somewhere in the mountains where people are skiing, and they end up somewhere where they never intended to go. And my question back then was, why is this the case? Why are we just willingly and blindly following these navigation aids? And so I asked the question, imagine you are in an unfamiliar surrounding and your navigation aid leads you into getting lost. You end up somewhere where you didn't want to go. You get lost due to your navigation system. Who is responsible for the mistake? And I did that survey in 3 countries. In the UK, 1/4 blamed the system for ending up lost. In Germany, it was 1/3, 33%. And in the US, this number rose even to about 47%. So every other person in the US blamed the navigation device for getting lost. And now, from a cognitive point of view, we have to question ourselves, what does that mean? We are not engaging with it anymore. And still, since we do not have anything like autonomous driving yet, it's only tested, it's still me who has to make the decision. If the navigation aid tells me, make a right turn, but I see the street sign, you are not allowed to enter this street due to, let's say, San Mateo festival, and I enter it anyway because the navigation system told me and the police stops me, I cannot say, sorry officer, the navigation system told me so I had to follow. No, there's no reason, there's no excuse for that. It's me who has to take the decision and the consequences. And this is what many people do not do, which means these navigation aids, and this is something I said yesterday in the consciousness course as well, AI is supposed to support us, to help us, But what we make out of it is we give the task fully to the AI and say, do the job for me. And this is what many lecturers claim that their students are now doing with things like ChatGPT, saying, okay, they have their task, they just type it into ChatGPT and then they hand in their reports, things like that. I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't want to go into details here, but that's the problem, that we humans do not engage anymore with the tasks. And this might be a problem. And we did a study on that, in which we told the participants in one condition, just follow the instructions of the navigation aid. So we had such a navigation experiments like the ones I showed you before, where the navigation system just told you with indicating arrows or with verbal red speech where to go. And in one condition, they passively had to follow by just pushing the appropriate buttons. So whenever the navigation device told them make a right turn, they clicked on the right arrow key and so on. And here on the left, in the first bar, you see what we called passive motoric navigation. And it was a total of 18 intersections that they should follow. And the ones they could produce afterwards, after the execution phase or learning phase, was around 8 intersections, so less than 50%. It is definitely higher than random, than chance, because chance in this case would have been 33% because we have left, right, and straight. But still, that's not really a good performance if you want to go somewhere, because you have to imagine in everyday life, if you make one incorrect turn, then the chance is very high of getting totally lost on your path, that you will not end up where you wanted to go. So then we had passive visual exposure. What does that mean? We simply set the participants in front of the computer, told them to watch the video and nothing else. And this group of participants was capable of, on average, having something like 10.5 correct intersections. So on average, 2 more intersections than the group that just followed the instructions, even though we did not tell them anything. Then we had a self-read instruction, and then there was an instruction that was read by an experimenter where we could see, okay, when people have to engage themselves and have to read and then they have to transfer it into the environment, it seems to be more complicated when somebody reads it to them. But it did not make any difference whether the instruction was read by a real human being or by an AI system. These are the 2 bars to the right. But what we find in this experiment basically is this: 3 of 4 conditions are significantly different from the passive condition where they just followed the instruction. I don't want to say that AI makes us dumb or anything like that. And I myself, when I came here to Oviedo, of course I used Google Maps at the beginning to get oriented. That's fine. But you just need to make sure that you somehow engage with the task. And in the instruction that was experimenter read, I forgot to tell you this, there we told the participants that they should follow the motoric things, but should also try to remember the path. So just the instruction, try to remember the path, was enough to have more than 3.5 more correct answers than by just using blindly the smartphone. In the US, they already have an expression for blindly following a navigation device, and the US Rangers call this effect death by GPS. So many people get lost in US national parks and are just found couple of weeks or months later being dead, just by the fact that they were blindly using a navigation device, no matter what the consequences or what the results were, like running out of power, having no GPS signal. But the problem is most of them do not really engage with maps anymore. And they do not have any backup systems. They totally rely on the navigation aid. And this is quite problematic. Especially when we want to take a look into the future. So many people, whenever I give talks at home, at university, or when I have to give an interview, it's always the same. Elder people are starting to ask, for a healthy aging, what would you suggest as a psychologist I should do? And then they ask something like, should I do crossword puzzles, sudokus, read more? What should I do? And then I say, you have to engage with something, but you should do different things, because crossword puzzles, sudokus, is something that we automatize throughout time with more practice. When you've never did crossword puzzles, then you could do that for some time. But our brain is so capable that it starts to know the things, we have knowledge, and so a crossword puzzle, things are repeatedly showing up, which means from a certain point onward, it does not help us in using our working memory, our problem-solving strategies. So we have to engage with new things. Same with Sudokus, it's just strategies. When I compare my own performance with that of my wife, she does Sudokus on a regular basis. I'm totally lost in comparison to her. She's way faster and she doesn't make that many mistakes than I'm doing. So she automatized it. It's not the fact that she is smarter than I am. Probably she is, I don't doubt that, but that is not proof of being smarter, that you can do Sudokus in no time. Which means I tell the people always to engage with new things. And even if you like to read, you have certain preferences of genre or authors that you like, but they are all in the same fashion, in the same style. So after you read a couple of books, you know how the plot is about to make a twist and what would be the likely outcome, or the descriptions of the surroundings are pretty similar. So then I tell them, you should start to engage with something new. Switch the author, switch the topic, what you are reading. Or the best thing you could do from my point of view, because that's then related to spatial orientation again, is to travel. Don't go for the 22nd time to the same place on vacation. If you are capable, choose a different country, a different culture, because this is what engages you with the language, the people, or with orienting, getting new places. You have to get used to the new places. So this is something that I tell the people they should do. Try to train their brain, their cognitive system, like a muscle. And that's true for our brain as well, like a regular muscle in my arms, in my bones, wherever in my body. It's the same. Use it or lose it. We cannot put our brain to rest, so to speak. We have to use it. It's active all the time, but it's not like I'm taking 2 weeks off with my brain so that it can get fresh again, something like that. That doesn't make any sense. So we have to use it. And here it's important to engage people with AI systems. And this is true not only for wayfinding and navigation aids, but for all use of AI. So when we interact with things like ChatGPT, using them for brainstorming or for polishing my text, that's absolutely fine. But simply typing a prompt in, getting the answer and handing in my report, that will work. If you say, okay, there's a close deadline, I will not make it, then of course you could do that once. But the problem is that we are getting used to it, and it's so convenient that we say, okay, I'll do it again, just one more time. And then we do it over and over again. And that's the problem. And that could possibly. There's no long-term experiments or long-term studies out yet, I think, that show any effects, but I would claim that it could lead to at least some earlier cognitive deterioration during aging. So I don't want to say that young people who use ChatGPT for university are starting to get dumb immediately, but for a healthy aging, I definitely warn people, if they are not engaging with the different systems, no matter what it is, that can have severe consequences. So going to the final points, to wrap it up a little bit, just to show you a little bit more, so the diversion, where to go. We talked about in our consciousness course about mindfulness, imagination. Also, for spatial orientation, we could show that when people are engaged with an imagination task beforehand, they could become much better. Even those people who claimed that they are very bad at navigating. In this left experiment, a former student of mine had a clever idea saying, okay, I want to look a little bit more towards therapy for the future, and I want to see in our wayfinding experiments whether an imagination task could improve participants' performance. And what he did was to tell them, imagine you are a human being in an unknown environment and you have to find your way through that environment. And then they learned our classical layout with, in this case, visual stimuli, and so they had to proceed. And another condition was that we told them, back then I didn't work much yet with smells, and therefore we told them, imagine you are a rat with gray fur, with a long tail, with 4 feet, and as a rat, you have a very good sense of smell, and you are able to navigate through unknown environments pretty well. And that's what they were imagining. So the story was longer, but basically the information was that. And what we found out was that those who did the imagination task first were later significantly better in the wayfinding phase than those with the regular instruction as humans. Then, I'm grateful for that comment. One reviewer on the paper said, well, but you need to have a proper control. This is due to experience and we are not sure whether this was the intervention or not. You need to invent another figure that people had to imagine. And so we generated a condition where my former student invented an alien with blue fur and called it a squabble. So there was no experience, nothing you could compare this animal or this alien with, and the wording was pretty much the same as in the rat condition, but with no possibility of trying to use our own knowledge. And the interesting finding here was that people from this condition were even significantly better than those in the rat condition, which showed that with simple imagination tasks, when people engage, you can increase their performance level right away. So it's not as if you have to take long hour classes, you have to do lots of exercises. It's just enough to engage the people with the task, in this case with imagination. And so on the right hand side, to deviate a little bit, that's something that I already mentioned before, the term of active consideration. So here we initially talked about consciousness. I think we had something like consciousness in politics, because we were interested in the type of argument. And why am I presenting this work here, or just speaking briefly about that? I mentioned it before in my previous talk when I said whenever you want to get money for research grants, you should be careful in the wording, or in the topic. And this also not only accounts for consciousness, because that's how the paper turned out to be, namely active consideration in an emotional context, implications for information processing. That's the full paper is about consciousness and how the word consciousness is used in politics and in everyday life. But as I said earlier, the reviewers did not accept that. And that's pretty much the same trouble that we are faced with when we talk about spatial cognition, wayfinding, and smell. As I said in the beginning, one action editor was not convinced, saying that's useless, and he rejected outright. Many reviewers still say, this is not really interesting, this is not really valuable, why are you doing such research only for the sake of research, and so on. That's things I still, after way more than 5 years, am still confronted with. We had book chapters published so far. We had, as I showed you, a state-of-the-art review. And still, people are questioning the use of it. So I hope that I was able to show you why it is important and that you at least believe me. Here's, to wrap up, just my idea of what landmark-based wayfinding is. As I said, it's a multi-sensory process, but I think it's also a combination of different strategies. So my assumption is that landmark-based wayfinding is a kind of mixture between at least sequential learning and landmarks, because I do not remember each and every visual or acoustic detail at an intersection. So most of the times it would be sufficient to say, okay, at the church I have to make a right turn. Then I will just move on for 3 intersections, and then there is a cideria at the corner, and so there I have to make a left turn. So it's probably a combination, because otherwise we did experiments like that where we tried in Gießen to do experiments with, at every turn that there's a valuable landmark, it was a distance of just about 2 kilometers, and it took the people almost 4 hours. It was 2.5, 3 hours that people took, because the path was so complicated and they were always looking at every other 10 meters for the landmark and couldn't find it because it was so far away. So that this is not the usual way that we orient ourselves in the surroundings. And importantly, at the end, I have here a scheme from a paper that has been published by some archaeologists. Because nowadays archaeologists are also trying to figure out, for example, when you have the from the Egypt or from the Romans, they are trying to reinvent the smells from back then. And this is also helpful to understand how people lived back then. It's also valuable for museums because they become more interactive. Because when you are there and you see, let's say, an original mummy, but there is no real smell to it, or you do not hear, sometimes they did that before in museums, having the sounds or what music was played in that context, that really helps us to better understand, to better imagine how things have been, to get that feeling of how it must have felt like to be in that time, maybe in that society. And so they are trying to reinvent smells in order not to make us feel better like in commercial terms, but to have a more immersive experience in museums, for example. And so they said olfaction has a major effect on how we perceive and navigate the world. And this is also being credited in the so-called spatial orientation hypothesis by, I think it's Lynn Jacobs. And she proposed that more than 10 years ago, that she said one of the functions of olfaction is spatial orientation. And that's why evolution and nature came about, to provide us still, even though we walk upright and like a dog, we do not sniff on the floor. And that's why the dog has to have more genes for processing olfaction than we do, because we do not have to filter out so many other particles of the air. So it's a question of not whether something is doable or not. I hope I was clear in showing that we can use smells to navigate, but it's a question of necessity. Is it necessary for us to do that? We all know for visually impaired people or for blind people, we totally accept that they have better senses of hearing, better senses of smell. But as sighted people, we do not credit these senses, from my perspective, enough. And to make the final point, and that's when I'm about to close, is that we are capable of differentiating between many different colors. Probably less in auditory signals. But there are some estimations, or there have been some estimations from the late 1970s. It was a publication by Kane in Science, where it was said humans can only discriminate between about 10,000 different smells. But the problem is of that work that it was the identification, what people could name. And here we again have, like in the topic of consciousness, the problem of naming. We showed that people do not need to identify smells, they just have to be able to differentiate between smells. And this is something that a study like Buschtidt and colleagues, they simulated it, and their assumption was that humans could be able to differentiate up to 1 billion different smells. There has been some critique and the number is lowered again, but still it stays the way that humans are capable of differentiating between many, many more smells than sounds or colors. So I hope that I was able to encourage you a little bit to engage into that topic of smell and spatial orientation, or at least into smell, no matter what you want to make out of it, because currently all over the world the interest in smell is rising, probably also as a consequence of the corona pandemic, when many people suffered for at least a couple of days from smell and taste loss. Some of them do not get their smell and taste back. Some, as a long-term consequence, do even acquire smell loss between 6 and 12 months after they were infected with the coronavirus. So this is a field that also from a medical point of view plays a huge role. But for us as psychologists, it's our own idea, our own motivation to say, okay, where's the niche that I want to find for myself, for my research? I have found my niche, and this is a very small one, and it's tough to fight against your enemies, so to speak, not literally, but on a scientific level. It's a really tough field to be in, but I hope that it will become easier in the future due to the interest, and that's why I wanted to encourage you also to engage with me together in the field of smell research within our psychological research. So thank you very much for your interest, and maybe you have questions. Thank you. This is the literature, and here's my final quote. I cannot tell you where it's from. I got it from my a doctoral student. She provided me with this quote, but unfortunately for this I do not have the reference. I think it also was just a meme somewhere on Instagram that somebody posted a picture with that sentence on it. But I think it's absolutely true. So, do you have any questions?
So, is there any research on this topic, but in animals? For example, we that work with snails or with dogs or something like that.
So I'm not too familiar with the animal literature, but as we have seen with the comparison of Porter and colleagues, where they compared dogs to humans, where they had humans crawling around Berkeley campus, there is, of course, lots of literature. And when I started with my first ideas about these projects, that was around, I think, 2016, 2017 at that time. First of all, I did a literature research. And what I found on the keywords of olfaction and landmarks. So with these two keywords. Back then on PubMed, I just found 7 entries that were concerned with these two topics. And I think 5 of them really dealt with desert ants. And so all of these 7 were concerned with animals. So there was no research available on humans. There is a lot of research, but also desert ants, for instance, they are capable of path integration. So landmarks is sometimes shown that animals use visual landmarks or any surrounding features. But exactly with these keywords, I could only find research on animals. But if you widen your search, that you accept something like sequential learning or whatever, you might find a lot more, but also for dogs. This is something that is for us really difficult because you give it a piece of cloth, smelling on it, and then it starts to walk. There is no need for any landmarks or whatever. It just follows the scent trail. This is something that has shown humans can do, but normally it's inappropriate for us to crawl around the floor looking for somebody. So here we also have to ask the question whether it is useful or not. In this case, for my research and in general for science, it was useful to show that humans are capable of doing that, but you would not pursue something like that more. In the meantime, it has also shown, due to that myth of humans having a bad smell or sense of smell, it's always claimed that smell is a diffuse sense, because smells are not permanent. Somebody walks by you and he or she has lots of perfume on, then you realize it, but after some while it's gone. So smells are very diffuse, and so it was said, okay, we do not have 3D smell. But that's also not true. It has been shown for auditory signals, also in blind people, but also in sighted people, that we can perceive auditory signals 3-dimensionally. That's logic. Our left and right ear are apart from each other on different sides of the head, which means that the sounds, the waves, enter the ears at different time points. And so we can locate where a sound comes from, mostly. It's pretty much the same why we have 2 nostrils. Otherwise, if it were that diffuse and would just be for that we can smell something and would not be worth for orientation, then we would just need 1 nostril, but not 2. And it has recently been shown also by the medical department of Dresden University Clinic, or the Dresden University, that humans can smell 3D. It's a very complicated topic, and it gets even worse if you start to differentiate between olfaction, which is supposed to be more cognitive processing of smells, versus trigeminal processing, which is the nerve in your front head. This is more for acids, for dangerous stuff that is processed on a body level, but not on a cognitive level. And so they also can show that there's a differentiation between these two smelling systems. So the issue becomes even worse when you start to think in medical terms, saying, okay, I have to take this nervous system as well as my cognitive system both into account. And that's what one of my students is currently pursuing. She's trying to figure out whether there is a difference between olfactory stimuli and trigeminal stimuli, because those seem to be, from an evolutionary point of view, things that warn us of poisonous or dangerous substances, for instance. And so they do not need any cognitive evaluation. But when you try, let's say, a cider for the first time, then you evaluate for yourself. Do I like it? Is it sweet enough? Or do I like the sourness of it? What about the level of alcohol and so on? So we reflect on the things. But this is something that then could also make different outputs. So far in my research, we are trying to avoid any potentially dangerous substances. So nail polish and what did we have? Aftershave was about the maximum that we used. So we did not have anything like gasoline, for instance, anything like, we had nail polish, but we did not use nail polish remover, because this is also something, when you smell at gasoline or nail polish remover, you all of a sudden, you directly have such a bad feeling in your nose. It's just like you're shivering as if you are biting directly into a lemon. That's something that does not need to be processed immediately by your cognitive system. It's already processed in order to encourage your behavior, to stay away from it, or not to inhale, or not to drink, or whatever. So coming back to that point, it's really a difficult field. And when I started, the literature that was available was just in the animal kingdom. So there's much more, and there scientists also appreciate the value of the olfactory system. But in humans so far, as I said, it's increasing, but it's not as high as for animals. Okay. If there's no more questions, then again,
Thank you, Kai.
Thank you for your interest.
For your visit, and thank you for all your valuable conferences and talks. I think we've all enjoyed them very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for hosting me. I had a great time. And I'm looking forward, whenever you have ideas, whenever you have questions, just feel free. Even though my stay, the official stay, is over now, does not mean that you should not ask further questions, get in contact. Whenever you have ideas, whenever you think I would like to collaborate. We already talked about the fact that if you are, or if you want to pursue maybe something like a thesis on a certain topic, just feel free to ask. We will try to figure something out that is valuable for everybody, or that is doable for everybody. But it's not like, okay, we had a visitor, nice ideas, let's move on. So if there's anything in the topic of consciousness research, in the topic of spatial cognition with smells, auditory signals, even vision, just let me know and we will try to figure something out. Okay, so thanks again, and have a great afternoon and a great weekend, and I hope that you can enjoy the rest of San Mateo without any disturbances, without any annoying moments. So have fun and hope to see you soon. Thank you.